next presenter will be Wayne Howell. Wayne Howell is the Cultural Resource Specialist for Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. Wayne has conducted archaeology throughout Central America, the Western U.S., and Alaska. Employed by the National Park Service since 1995. Wayne has served as Cultural Resource Specialist in the Glacier Bay National Park, carrying out archaeology, history, ethnography, as well as fostering positive relationships between the National Park Service and the neighboring Tlingit Native communities. Wayne Howell will be assisted by Ken Grant. Ken is one of my time brothers. He is currently with the National Park Service at Glacier Bay. Please welcome Wayne Howell.
I should add that I am recently retired as a cultural resource manager at Glacier Bay, and blissfully so. My Tlingit name is Tlingit. I was adopted into the Wushkitan clan, the Shark's Backbone House, by Sam Hamlin Sr. And I'll be talking about some of that landscape today. What we're going to be looking at is, we're going to look at about a 300-year period of the evolution of Glacier Bay as a landscape, and how the ancestors of the Huna people adapted to that landscape, and how they named the landscape, and in so doing, we'll learn something about how they practice of place naming. The landscape of Glacier Bay is really a great place to do this kind of study because of two sets of data we have. On one side, we have a wonderful ethnographic record, beginning first and foremost with a compelling story of place, with the advance of the glacier coming down and destroying the ancestral village of the Huna people. That story has captivated outsiders, visitors to the bay since they first started arriving at the time of John Muir, and has been ongoing since. To anchor those stories in place, we have the Huna Tlingit place name map, the place name map of the Huna Kawu that was originally started by Tom Thornton and since, with Harold involved in that, handed off to the Huna Indian Association, and then we with the National Park Service worked with HIA to compile the final data and work toward publication. And that map was published by HIA under the supervision of Johanna Dugdal, who's with us, and it's been a wonderful tool for a lot of people from Huna. On that map, we're going to concentrate on the lower part of Glacier Bay, where there is an assemblage of names that tell a lot of this story. First and foremost, and according to my title, is there are three names for Glacier Bay, all of them applying to the same landscape, but different landscapes, and all relating to different periods in time. The first name we'll be talking about is Sei Shu Yi, and as Tom Thornton was mentioning earlier, a lot of times these names are not just a single name, but an assemblage of names. And so all of these names underlined in white relate to that ancestral ancient landscape of Sei Shu Yi, and we'll talk about that in detail here. In addition, for the last 130 years, there have been a number of accounts of the story of Glacier Bay recorded in literature or in recordings. And we have compiled a table of those. I present that here. We're not going to linger over it, but the first file on the list are outsiders that had Huna people tell them about the story, and they would relate it in some form or another. And then, beginning with Annie Houston, you get first-person accounts of these stories. Some published, some not, but critical to this are the publications in Richard and Nora Dunhammer's books, those stories told by Amy Marvin and Susie James. In addition, on the other side of the record, we have wonderful information about Glacier Bay from the landscape itself. Among other things, we have the modern topography of Glacier Bay that tells a lot of that story. Looking at the landscape, the gray areas are the bedrock confines of the glacial fjord. That's kind of what holds the glacier in place. We have this deep trough, which is the base of the fjord, which was occupied by the glacier for much of this time. And then all of this land down here, this green down here, is soft sediment, sands and gravels that were deposited by the glacier. And that is critical in our understanding because those soft sediments, both in Lower Glacier Bay and on the islands in the middle part of the bay, hosted vegetation communities in the past that were not completely destroyed by the advancing glacier. It had a tendency to leave little pockets here and there, and those relic landscapes are still out there. And with due diligence, you can go out on the landscape and you can find them to this day. Glacier Bay was recognized for this important aspect way back in the beginning of scientific interest in Glacier Bay, and that was much of what led to the designation of Glacier Bay National Monument in 1925, was the presence of these ancient, what they call interstadial forests. In addition to the forests, which are big and dramatic, we also find, if you look hard enough, you can find other vegetated communities scattered throughout these relic landscapes, including copses of willows, and in some places, these mats of grasses pressed down that represent the existence of old meadows, which occur in many of the ancestral stories of Glacier Bay. And another aspect of this is that because this place is so fascinating for geologists, for glaciologists, for anthropologists, there's been about 130 years of research going on here, so there's a big record of Western research to complement the ethnographic record, and the two blend beautifully together in this case. And another good thing is that all of those trees and vegetative matter provide us with organic materials that we're able to do radiocarbon dating on. So in addition to helping us recreate the ancient landscapes, it provides us with a way to create a chronology, basically a chronological scaffolding that helps anchor the ethnographic stories in time. And the trees provide an added benefit because if you're able to link living or long dead trees with living trees, it's possible to create a chronological record that extends from the present into the past and actually record the time when the actual years when these trees died. And the trees also carry a climate record with them, so you can see what the climate was doing at these times in the past. And so it gives us a window into the past that wouldn't exist otherwise, or a window into the past that helps to illuminate and animate the ethnographic stories. The way the work goes about is you go out into the landscape, you find these trees, and you start digging around them. And I will point out, many of you may have heard this story before. Kathy Conner, who's in the audience with us, and Dan Monteith, both professors at UAS, worked a research project with us. But the backbone of that research has been carried on by a gentleman by the name of Greg Strevler. He's a Gustavus resident. That's Greg right back there, and he has been tramping around the landscape out there for about the last 50 years, piecing this together. Very diligent work, very solid work, and we owe a great debt of gratitude to Greg and his diligence. So what you do is you find the tree, you dig down around it, you see this reddish soil in here, you find where the landscape it was growing in, gives you an idea of what the environment was like, and then also you can look at what killed it. And in this case, it was sedimentation coming in and encapsulating the tree and basically drowning it. And you can take a radiocarbon date from the outer rings of the tree, run that, and get an age estimate for the tree. And so this tree that we were looking at was on the tip of Francis Island in Middle Glacier Bay. Radiocarbon date showed us that it died about 4,800 years ago. That's what the outer ring dates was. And so as we start to look at these trees, it turns out that in the lower bays, another set of researchers, Dan Lawson and Greg Wiles, were able to link long dead trees with recently dead trees that were growing up out of the floodplain and with living trees, and they were able to create a dendrochronological record and link that into the past so that we can actually read the actual year dates of a lot of the death of these trees. And the trees also capture historic events. This is an example of a tree from Lituya Bay recording the impact of the giant tsunami of 1854. And so they are wonderful records of history. We also looked at marine sediments when we could find them, recover the shells, see the little white specks in there, recover the shells, and do radiocarbon dates on those and determine when parts of the bay were marine or not. And when we compile all these scenes together, we're able to start marching down the bay and recreating the landscape evolution. And in this image, one thing about these slides is that I use the ancient landscape is portrayed as a semi-transparent layer, and the modern landscape is visible underneath it, so that this is the modern day landscape. This is Bartlett Cove, park headquarters is right in here. And then the recreation shows how the glacier began to advance down bay. And as it advanced, it built a sediment lobe out in front of it. And that sediment lobe would grow trees on it. And then as it would move and stabilize, more sediments would come, bury the forest, preserve them. And that's how we're able to read the record. The black dots represent marine sediments that we found, marine deposits we found that indicate that 2,500 years ago, the lower part of the bay, the landscape of Seishuyi at that time was marine, so Seishuyi did not yet exist. 1,500 years ago, the glacier continued its advance. It got down into the middle part of the bay, and basically then it settled in and didn't move too much for about 1,000 years. And during this 1,000-year period, it continued to shed sediments down bay and build a landscape, and that landscape became vegetated. And by about 300 years ago, it had developed a forest in many areas. Much of it was still dry and barren, and we find evidence of that. But what happens is that it begins to start to mesh with the story of Seishuyi and the story of the ancestral Huna presence in Seishuyi. One thing that is also important is that you see that black line running through here. That's a medial moraine that was figured out by a geologist looking at the rock types from east and west arm. And he was able to determine that the west arm ice advanced much more robustly than the east arm ice. And that medial moraine plays an important part in our story. And so the landscape of Seishuyi, the name translates as area at the end of the glacial silt or clay. And that's a really wonderful description of a glacial outwash plain. Very, very apropos. The big glaciers, the plain, and then a smaller glacier, which we believe was probably that medial moraine, Little Black Glacier, and that story is related in the account of Susie James in Richard Norris' publication. And Susie talks about when the glacier began to advance, when this destabilization happened, and it began to advance, the new one, the big glacier, overrode Sitkituch, and in the vicinity of a place called Among the Little Lakes, which we'll get to here in a second. The stories also tell of two fish streams. One fish stream, the sockeye system, Gahini and Gahini Plain, and probably flowing out of some lakes that were dammed up in the Bear Crack Valley and the side valleys over there, and there's geologic evidence for that damming dating to about 500 years ago. And then another fish stream called Chukanhini that coursed through some meadows on the west side of the valley, and that was the main place of the Chukanadi clan. And then in the lower part of the landscape, there was a sand dune country, Klaushayi, and in that area, they built their main village up on a sand dune, or perhaps a glacial moraine, but probably on the sand dune, a place called Klausha Shakian, Sound Mountain Town. And all of this fits nicely with the landscape evidence that we find in our geologic research. A second village, probably a summerfish village, was located at a place called Tuchgili Black Cliff, which we think relates to a place called Rush Point on the west side of Glacier Bay, which is a modern black cliff exposed over there. So the beautiful coordination between the oral tradition and the geology fits very nicely here. And it fits into this time frame of probably about 500 years ago beginning, but most definitely by 300 years ago, everything was meshing together. And it allows us to create an image of a landscape that was not Glacier Bay, rather a terrestrial landscape with fish streams and a village in it. It was a very productive place and a place of refuge for the people. We know from the stories of Glacier Bay that the glacier advanced and destroyed the village probably about 500 years ago, and I'll talk about how we figured that out. What we did was we took our radiocarbon dates from Bartlett Cove, took the 5 most recent, averaged them, got a date, got a number of years, and then took the account of the Vancouver party that came in 1794. And our early date was 1725, the Vancouver party was 1794, that's 70 years, cut it in half. You get the maximum extent of the ice about 1760, and the overrunning of the village probably about 1750 AD. Subsequent to that research, Dan Lawson and Greg Wiles went out and they recovered 55 tree ring dates from trees growing throughout Lower Glacier Bay, and they were able to get death dates, and the numbers in parentheses that you see there are the years that those trees died. And the trees died as sediment started to accumulate over them. And so if you plot those death dates out on a scale, assuming that the glacier is off to the left side of the screen, somewhere out of sight, and that the trees are growing on Seishuyi, and the sediment is coming down and encapsulating them and killing them, you see that prior to the early 1700s, there was a stable environment with a forest growing on it. Then all of a sudden, a bunch of trees started dying. For about a 30-year period, a bunch of trees died, and then after about 1730 or 1735, no more trees grew on that landscape. That's because it was covered with ice. Okay, and so that allows us to really bracket when that glacial advance was, and it coincides very nicely with the earlier research of Greg Strugler and bunch. And so about 250 years ago, the glacier advanced, the clans moved out and established new villages. The Kagwantan moved to Kaknewu. The Wushitan established a fort up in Excursion Inlet, Watidinu, and the Chukanadi clan migrated out first to a place called Klakukas on the Icy Strait, and then eventually moved inside and took shelter behind a large cliff called Gao and established a village of Gaotukan, which was also called Hudia, and placed shelter from the north wind, with the north wind coming off the glacier. What's really interesting is that the Chukanadi clan also carries a story of life after they left Glacier Bay, and of the difficulties they faced as they tried to find a new place to live. And they have a story about soon after they established themselves in Huna, after a period of about 3 years of roaming across the landscape, having experienced their exodus from Seishuyi, when they finally got settled in Huna, and things were starting to look up, then there was a period where summer didn't happen, where winter followed winter. And interestingly, the tree ring record from trees growing up on the ridges around Glacier Bay, the tree rings capture a signature of that event where there was no growth of trees during a 2-year period from 1754 to 1755. And so that coincides very nicely with the other dating that we've got. And that would put the founding of Huna right about 1753, 1754. It was a very difficult time, a very stressful time, because as the glacier advanced from 1700 to about 1760, the weight of the glacier pushed the land down, and as the land sank, the sea level relative to the land rose, and as it rose, it destroyed the landscape, destroyed the old campsites, the fish camps, stuff like that. It also ate into the beach fringe, and it deposited silt up in salmon streams. It would have eaten away at the intertidal zone, which is a rich productive zone. It would have eaten away the nearshore area where so many berry patches and beach greens grow. So it would have been a time of terrible loss of foods. There was a lot more snow, a lot of icebergs floating around, colder winters, strong winds, a very tough time. And so after the glacier retreated in 1770, you see I threw a new date in there, but in 1770 the glacier retreated, and as it retreated it began to rebound, and it began to establish this new beach berm that became an attractive place for people to live. And we know that because of another group of researchers that did some research in Icy Strait trying to figure out the history of and the rate of isostatic rebound, the rebound of the land after the glacier left. And what they did is they went out on the landscape and located these old beach berms and poured trees growing on them, and were able to determine that probably about 1770 was the time of the maximum extent of the ice, at which point it began to retreat. So once again, that dating fits very nicely with what we figured out. We've been able to go out onto the landscape and locate those old features. And here's a picture showing just such a place. This is an excursion inlet. This is the wave cut riser that was created during the time of the rising water. Here's an alluvial fan it's cutting into. And then as I turn and take another photograph looking up onto the area right above the riser, it's hard to see. These things are really hard to photograph, but there's a soil core that is standing in the middle of a trench that would have been a trench that they used to haul their canoes up out of the surf. And then over to the left, there was a platform that they leveled off, and with that sediment core, we were able to poke in and find fragments of fire-cracked rock and charcoal, which is where their camp was. These camps would have dated to the 1770s, 80s, and probably into the 90s. And we've located about 15 of them. A couple of them, I think, do have place names, but most of them do not. They're just out there in the archaeological record. So, we know that the glacier advanced into the middle part of Icy Strait. Here's a bathymetric image of the bottom of Glacier Bay and Icy Strait. And this is the terminal moraine of the glacier. The Hoona people also have stories about what they went through at that time, a very difficult time. And as a way to get the glacier to halt its advance, they sacrificed a slave up on the glacier. And the glacier stopped and began its retreat, and they applied a name onto the landscape at Point Adolphus, Stadawaklutu, which is the name of the slave who was sacrificed. So once again, name associated with the landscape that relates to a historic event and to an interaction with the landscape. Very dramatic, very poignant stuff. The second name of Glacier Bay is Haptua, inside the icebergs. It's is a name that applies after about 1770 as the glacier began to retreat, and we actually have an eyewitness account of that from the Vancouver expedition of 1794 who came through Icy Strait, and their ship surgeon Archibald Menzies talks about going and witnessing that landscape, and he says, as we were rowing amongst the ice for a projecting pillar in the middle of the bay to satisfy our curiosity and take some bearings from the top of it, we suddenly found ourselves in the most critical situation by perceiving that many of the huge pieces of ice about us were aground, while others of less magnitude were in rapid motion by the influence of the tide, and frequently dashing against the stationary ones with a force sufficient to crush either of our boats. Can you imagine that? So big icebergs sitting aground, other big icebergs not aground, crashing around. And we actually, amazingly, have a relic of that landscape that has survived. And also, there's a name that probably applied to the landscape at that time. You see that prominent point, that is, say, Kaiflutu. It became an important place for the Wushutam clan. Here is a bathymetric image, side scan sonar image of the bottom of Glacier Bay, and those gouges that you see were created by the giant icebergs dragging their bottoms as they fleshed out of Glacier Bay with the currents. And look at this crazy place right here. I've got a blow-up of it. There is a big iceberg that was coming out of the bay and being influenced by the changing tide. See it zigzagging through here? Looks like a Martian landing zone or something like that, but it was a big iceberg that was coming down with the tides and as it exited Glacier Bay. The third name for Glacier Bay and the modern name that it carries is Sit'etigei, the band place of the glacier. And Catherine Mills talks about how that came about as the glacier retreated and moved away, and the bay replaced it. They renamed it, so it's a very dynamic naming process. And here's a map from 1894 of Sit'etigei. You can see that the east arm is totally plugged with ice, the west arm is more open. And it was a very important place for the Hoona people. You can see that it had a lot of icebergs in it still, but those icebergs also created an ideal habitat for seals. And here are some seal hunters dressed in camouflage on their way up to hunt for seals. And they maintained a seal hunting camp near Gloomy Knob. We've located this on the ground. And once again, this is an important camp that they probably used for a long period of time, but we don't have a place name for it. So some places, I'm sure it probably had a name, but the name just hasn't come through to us. So, getting back to Seishuyi, as they moved back into Seishuyi was gone. It was now Sit'etigei, but they brought with them the memory of the past landscape, and they applied those names to the modern landscape that they found. And many of the ancient names from Seishuyi were applied to a new landscape. For example, when Eliza Skidmore arrived in 1883, in Bartlett Cove, she reported that the people there were saying that the village, the fish camp and the fishery there was in the vicinity of where Klaushakian was. She recorded it in her orthography. And then in 1889, when George Emmons came through, he recorded it as Karkini, which was his derivation of Gatini. For the history buffs in the crowd, this log building right here was probably the trading post of Dick Willoughby, who later gained fame here in Juneau. Okay. And so Sitikigei was an important place, and they also started applying new names to the landscape that wouldn't have existed before the ice retreated. Kwatani, the important gull colonies in the middle part of Glacier Bay would have been covered by ice. Before that, Sikai got a new name, and then a place that didn't exist before was a place at the mouth of Berg Bay. Here is an image from the BC Provincial Archives. I think Steve Langdon found this image, and this is a picture taken at Sekai-Flutu. And we located that place on the ground as well. When John Muir came in 1879, he camped at the mouth of Berg Bay and encountered a village there. And I originally found this kind of odd that there was a settlement there because the fish stream is back at the head of the bay, but we went out on the landscape and using the place name map, we were able to find the remains of Hataden-Wu, which was the name of a fort. And so here's another really cool name. Up in upper Hugh Miller Inlet, there's a name, Guski Kwanduwu, White Man's Fort, and that was a bit of a puzzler for me until we went out on the landscape and found the remains of the camp that was built by, or utilized by the International Boundary Commission in 1907. So there's a place named with a very specific date to it. So the most recent names we've been able to find are probably one up in Bear Trap Cove, Hoostchini Git, which was a cabin that the Obert family maintained up through the 1920s, and perhaps on Kidney Island in the middle part of the Beardsleys, there was a seal camp maintained by the Shakely family up until about 1955. And that's the most recent names I've been able to find. So basically what we see is that as the naming went on, they were very descriptive of landscapes, including a lot of very specific detail. They captured natural processes as they were unfolding, captured historic events. It was an accretive process, adding layer upon layer. It was not a one-size-fits-all process. It was adaptive, changing names as new landscapes emerged, new features emerged. And some names persisted on the landscape for a very long time, while others were lost to us. And it was a continuous process in the past, but it halted sometime in the 20th century. And the point being, if it is not actively practiced, history is not recorded in the landscape, on the landscape, and we're going to lose it. And with that, we're going to use a case in point, which is the Indian Islands, and the very important Huna activity that took place out there from the 1920s through 1974. Ken?
Good chief. Sector Chief. I see a lot of noble people out there, and I can't escape the upbringing that I was brought up in. And I think that's what we're trying to promote when we have sharing of knowledge. And I have to acknowledge the eagles out there that are sitting here, noble people. Sami, Kingistit. And I see Bill Martin out here too, our grandchild. And I see Ernie Hillman out there. He's my in-law, married to my sister. And I see, we have a new ANS president sitting here too, Johanna. Very honored to have your presence here. And on my side, I see Tuish sitting back there, my grandchild sitting there, and Ethel Mackinnon sitting over here. I know I'm missing a whole bunch of you, but I guess we have another one sitting right here. Raise your hand there. So, anyway. But the one that we're talking about names here, and there is a name, and forgive me if I make a mistake, Tom. He's was adopted into the Kagwan Tom.
Our elder Bill asked you to talk a little louder. Bill Fawcett would like you to talk a little louder.
I'm really at a disadvantage because I had a little bit of heart problem and my voice gets pretty weak, so I hope you'll forgive me. Yeah. Tom Thornton was adopted into the Kagwantan, and you'll have to forgive me if there we go. I'm closer to it. Yeah. Yeah. Tom Thornton, Jan Chiesbach, Isai. You know, names really inspire people. Jan Chiesbach. And it means, and I'm pretty sure it's a wolf crying from hunger. And that's the way I see all of us sitting here right now, including the children in school throughout the villages. We're crying from hunger for knowledge of our ancestors. And that name really inspires me here. Anyway, I grew up in Huna amongst many top fishermen. Just Yeawach Kwaiti Hastatu Kunachawaya Woodsly Kit Yahyati Hastatu Yeawach Kwaiti Ya Askewu Gusuta. What I said is our grandfathers, our uncles that were fishermen, they were very solid people. They were just like the cliff, really strong. And I said, Gusuta, where is sleep? Where is sleep? I know, I fished out there with many of them. Joe White, William Johnson, Jimmy Martin, the Marks family. They were really sound. And that's the one thing I would wish that our young people would get, is this work ethic that was really strong. There was no question that you had to get up and make a living. There was no question. If you didn't put all your heart and soul into it, you starved in the winter. But my portion here are names that were left out. My grandfather, some of you that are fishermen might have known that there was a James Grant Point. It just didn't happen accidentally. He was out there fishing with his younger brother, not fishing, but they were out hunting. And they had an accident. Their canoe capsized at this point. And they lost his younger brother. And his name is the one I carry right now, Kosha. Kosha. And that's the reason my grandfather fished this point. And my dad fished it, and I fished it. The boats that I ran were the Alberta, the Island Queen, the Ocean Queen, and when I got the Gypsy Queen, they were moving, the Department of Fish and Game was moving us inwards, and I think I made my last set out there with the Island Queen. Another, my grandfather's name was Nakalsas Ish, and the name that for history's sake, I know we have legal ways of coming up with names for Alaska. You know, we can we could name it Nakalsas, and the way we said things. Ayan Adukshia is where he tied his net to make his set, hook up. So James Grant's hook up, Nakalsas Ish, Ayan Adukshia. Yeah. But there's other captains, George Dalton, Stuaka. We always knew it as Washington Hookup. And, but for history's sake, for our grandchildren, for our kids, many of our children have no memory of the legacy that is just one page back. Just one page back, you know, in our history books. For history's sake, Stuaka, Washington Hookup, he fished there too, and so did his son. Another name, Nuani. I saw the Marks family sitting here, and I saw Nora sitting here too. Nuani Hookup. I'm trying to think of his Tlingit name. Kityanai, Ayanutukchia, and also Jim Marks, North Pass. These are noble people that were sound. And I really like that North Pass and Nuani's hookup. When I see them anchoring up, they didn't fish all the tides. They knew the tides. And when I saw them anchored up by their station there, I just knew that they ate a pot of boiled fish and were sleeping good, waiting for the next tide. I wish they were here. And I see that. Oh, there he is, Kitanai. Yeah. Anyway, and then there were places. Steve Langdon and I and Richard Dalton went to. We went over to Fern Harbor, and there were many spots there that were hookups were made. I think Jim McKinley had a place there too, and Hong Kong. The person I was named after him was, when I was young, was Clutch, and that could be a good name for a spot where our people fished too. And while I'm on Jim McKinley, I see Al McKinley sitting over there. He's a cousin of mine, but something real big happened just recently. They changed Mount McKinley to Denali, and I think he's changing his name to Al Denali now too. He's got many names, I know. I think he wears a sombrero sometimes. But anyway, these names are a part of history, and I think they represent our people that were, like I said, they were like a cliff, very staunch, and disciplined, very disciplined. Work ethic was not a question, and I think all of you that are sitting that know something about it will agree with me. Yeah, oh yes, yeah, you can yeah, which yeah, good cheese, it is
Thank you all, and afterward I'm going to be outside out front, and I have a number of publications to give you. I've got some archaeological reports for surveys in Glacier Bay, as well as a book that contains the history of the Indian Islands fisheries. Thank you.
I wanted to compliment you guys for what you did here. The thing that you all did was you documented for our children our knowledge of glaciology, our knowledge of geology, our knowledge of geography. Those are very significant. We talk about place names, we need to associate it with the people, because I believe that so often we're alienated from our own place named places. And I want to just really compliment you, because you really documented the fact that our people had an educational system that taught them about the land and its resources and the names for it. Chief.
Tlingit place names are the very basis of our way of life, usually referred to as our subsistence way of life. They are living artifacts, and they identify who we are. We actually have time for questions and answers. Please direct your questions to any one of these gentlemen up here.
This is directed at anybody.
Excuse me, can we get a volunteer to turn this microphone? Thank you, Ishmael.
Questions?
Has there been,
To anyone of the panel?
you gotta hold it down. Oh, there. Is it work? Has there been an attempt to move the geographic place names into the USGS system of place names?
So I could try to answer that, although I don't speak on behalf of USGS. So as I tried to mention, and the presentation before mine also mentioned, there are efforts to make Alaska Native names official. And once they're made official, then they get into the USGS system. The USGS system only can record official names. There is no provision to keep a database of unofficial names. So unfortunately, we don't have that system. That's essentially what we're trying to do with the Alaska Native Place Names Project, is create a database that would be for all Alaska Native names, regardless of whether they're, quote, official or not. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. The follow-up to that is ethnographic information and oral history recognized as an official way to document place names?
You recognized by the USGS, or I mean, certainly that's the major and a very important source for documenting Alaska Native place names. The problem with the USGS system is that there's this process, right, that things have to go through. So when you're talking tens of thousands of names, getting them through that process is not always doesn't always move so quickly. There are other routes, and so for example, in Hawaii, they've had some very good relationships with the USGS in working to get batches of names, so hundreds of names approved at one time, rather than going through the kind of paperwork with one name at a time, like we saw here. So there's potential for other solutions, certainly.
Okay, Steve Lehman.
Thank you. This is directed at Mr. Jensen. I noticed in your presentation that there was at least attention being paid to the issue of pejorative names on the landscape. In Alaska, the pejorative names take a different form. One of them is Siwash. That name was imported and brought in from the Pacific Northwest and attributed to Native people. And the second name would be anything associated with klooch, which was the pejorative term for, especially in southeastern Alaska, for women. So I'm just inquiring about the nature of treatment of pejorative names, or let me just add as a little aside, places of genocide as well.
Yeah, one of the issues of supporting a name change is that it's a derogatory or pejorative name, and if that can be identified, and it certainly would be. One thing I should say is that the Alaska Historic Commission is a reactive commission, in that we react to proposals for place names. The commission doesn't have the funding to go out and search for names that would be potentially renamed. So if there's a proposal to name that, and it happens to be a derogatory proposal or a derogatory name that's proposed to be changed, it would certainly get more attention than others might. So, did that answer your question? Okay. All right.
Anyone else?
Are there any other questions?
This is more of a comment and a recent experience of mine. I recently read the book that is the novel picked for the University of Southeast this semester, Ernestine Hayes, and she told the story of the person of one of her friends who was a dancer, and she was of the grasses of Glacier Bay. And her name was, that's what it meant. It was her place. Her place was who she was. And then she told the story that you shared so beautifully today of the advancing of the glacier. And I would just recommend that everybody in the room read Ernestine's book this fall, along with the students at the university, because it really speaks to the land and being of the land and how important that is.
Are there any other questions?
This is just a question to Kenny. It's really amazing the tribute that you talked about of character that comes from making a living in icy straits fishery. And I've noticed in my own ethnography that there's an appreciation for the skills, the fortitude and so on you talked about in people who fish that even in other areas in Southeast, because it was so dangerous and it was such a difficult landscape but with high payoffs. And I'm wondering if we don't really have a way to honor that intersection of skills and livelihood and landscape. And do you have any suggestions for how that could be done, short of bringing it back, or is that what needs to be done? Because I'm sure it could be fished sustainably even today.
I really appreciate that question. I've been thinking about it. When I was still a captain, a young crewman asked me, what does it take to be a good captain? My response to him is, you have to be efficient. Get it? No, I've thought in Tlingit. Wasa asus kujin adeyana in wechat kawal kates tum hastatu shakte hastatu. I've thought about the skill of our elders. They didn't have tide book. They didn't have tide books. They didn't refer to it. They knew the movement of the tide, and I really believe they thought like a fish. They thought like a fish. They knew where the fish was going to come from, and the really skilled ones, I'm sure that's the way it was in my experience as a boat captain. I don't want to glorify myself, but I try to use the same tactics as the elders. Get down there in the water, feel the stream, and follow the fish. But I don't know how to document it. I guess it's just the Tlingit. Let's just give the Tlingit that solid Tlingit. And at Wasco was the Jew. At Wasco, they had knowledge, very, very intense knowledge of things. that is not documented. We can't put it on paper. So we got to give them credit for extreme knowledge of the way a fish thinks. That's the way I would think.
I'd like to follow up on that as well, Tom. One of the ways that the HIA, the Hood City Schools, and the Park Service have been working together is that they've been building these place names into the curriculum in the school. Richard Carsonson's been involved in that project, and basically the place names, you gather all the background information behind them, and in the case of what Ken was talking about, all of the work ethic and the moral integrity of these old captains, and you build that into the information package associated with that place name, and then you take the school kids out there to the landscape and share that with them, and that becomes kind of the moral anchor, or the geographic anchor of all of those valuable stories and ethics. And it's a great learning process. The kids just light up. Richard, you saw it out in Taylor Bay. They just come alive with this stuff. And so there is a way to do it, and it's building it into the curriculum. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Paulette Marino. I just wanted to take a moment and say that this is really beautiful and a significant moment to Ken and our elders and Joanna and our clan leaders, all those who have worked on these place names, to be able to come here this morning and to see that map with those names brought a lot of the elders that were sitting behind me and others just took a deep breath. Feels real good. So thank you, Ganesh, for that work. I know it's a lot of work, and this is something that did not slip away. We've seen it today, and it's a beginning. My question is in regards for some of the first presenters also, and those that are available. When you guys mentioned that when a name change takes place, and there's a Western name associated with a mountain or a stream or a landscape, and you go through the process of requirements to change it, there are a lot of requirements. But if a mountain or stream or geographic location does not have a name with the service, is it a shorter process if a clan or person from the area comes forward and wants to suggest the original name of that mountain or landscape without the requirements of a previous Western name? Is it a shorter process for the people of the area to go through the application of the naming? Thank you.
I can take a stab at it, maybe some other people can help it. I don't know if the process is any shorter, but because it still has to be, the name would still have to be distributed to all the adjacent landowners and affected communities or tribes or corporations. So it's still to get consensus if that's the appropriate name. You don't have the issue of changing the name and why the name was established initially. So there's one thing you don't have to deal with, is the name change. You still have to go through the process of deciding whether that's the appropriate name and there's a consensus for that name. So it might be a little easier, it might not be shorter. I guess that's what I'm saying.